Very good. So you're all very welcome to this talk this evening. The Sport and Human Performance Research Centre is a new research centre at the University of Limerick dedicated to innovative interdisciplinary research in sport and human performance. It aims to inform national and international best practice and through the creation of an international and national network to achieve global recognition for the quality of the research undertaken and the graduates that it produces. One of the initiatives of this research centre is this public lecture series, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce tonight's guest. So Dr. Amy Whitehead holds accreditation as a sport and exercise psychologist through the British Psychological Society and is a reader in sports psychology and coaching at Liverpool John Moores University. At Liverpool, Amy is the lead of the Coaching and Pedagogy Research Group and has a very impressive publication record on topics including understanding and enhancing athletes' psychological performance and coach development, often exploiting the method that we're going to hear about this evening, which is Think Aloud. She's also the co-editor, co-author of the excellent book Myths in Sports Coaching. And if you haven't seen that, I really encourage you to take a look at a copy. Her applied work has included consultancy for organisations such as UK Coaching, England Netball, St Helens RFC, British Cycling, the FA, Professional League and Non-League Football, and European Tour golfers. And while juggling that, she still finds time to train and compete as a triathlete as well. I first came across Amy's work when I was teaching Think Aloud to postgraduate students, and she was just starting off doing some of her work with golfers. And it was just really nice to see some fresh, some newly published research exploring a slightly different use of Think Aloud. And so I've been following Amy's publications in this area since, and it's a really useful tool which she's applied to many different areas. And given that I'm now supporting coach development, it's great to see that she's started to publish more in coach development as well, which makes my life easier in that sense also. So without any further ado, I'm going to welcome Amy and invite you to share your slides.
Thanks, Phil. I think I might ask you to do my introductions more often. Okay, I'm just going to share slides. Just let me know if you can see them okay. Sorry, back to the beginning. Phil, is that in the correct format?
That's in the correct format there, and you're back to the start now. Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Again, thanks so much, Phil, for the introduction and also for the invite. Really great to be here. As Phil mentions, what we're going to talk about tonight is the Think Aloud method. Now, I'll kind of introduce Think Aloud as I originally started using it as a research tool, but as you'll kind of gather throughout the presentation, we'll look at how it can be applied to practice. And just to give you a quick kind of summary, we've looked at how Think Aloud can then be applied into coaching practice, sports psychology practice, and also coach development. I haven't got time tonight to kind of talk you through everything, but hopefully you'll get a bit of a whistle-stop tour of Think Aloud, how it can be applied, and hopefully how you might be able to use it as both a research tool and if you are a coach or a practitioner within your context. So in terms of Think Aloud itself, it's very simply a methodology or a protocol designed by Erickson and Simon, originally used within cognitive psychology to look at how people solve problems and the processes people go through to work through puzzles. It was used quite early on in the 80s in chess to understand how kind of master chess players processed information on the board differently to novices. And I guess since the 2010, when I started my PhD and we applied it into golf, and there were some other researchers at the time, David Eccles, Remco Polman, starting to use Think Aloud within kind of the sport domain. So what we do is we give athletes, in this case, a clip mic and a dictaphone, and we ask them to verbalise everything they're thinking as they're playing or completing a task. So for example, in tennis, we've looked at the difference between males and females in practice and competition. We've looked at golfers' thought processes, differences between experts and novices, again, differences between practice and competition. And again, as cyclists, we've looked at kind of how they might think during a time trial. We've applied it to quite a lot of different contexts, and some of them contexts I'll share with you today. So I'll go into a little bit more detail around our golf research today, a little bit more detail around the cycling work we've done. But if anyone does want any other access to the papers, do drop me an email afterwards and I'll share kind of all the other research we've done in this area. I'm just going to share with you a little snapshot of what Think Aloud sounds like. Phil, if it doesn't come through, just please let me know and I'll reshare. Just make sure I've ticked that sound's coming through.
Right, let's go. Okay, first hole, par 5, up the hill. My focus point here off the tee is going to be that path up the right hand side. That'll be a good line into the flag as well. Okay, peg it up on the left side of the tee box to give me the best angle. Okay, just go through my pre-shot routine. Concentrate on what I've been working on. Nothing. Right, okay. It's kind of not a bad shot, down the right a little. First shot in anger for a while, so I'll take that. We're off and running.
So as you'll hear there, the golfer kind of talks through some of his pre-performance thoughts, his pre-performance routines, and then he gives us a bit of an evaluation afterwards. And as a sports psychologist, that can give me a lot from an applied perspective. So it can help me understand how a performer might react after a certain shot. It might help me understand what he or she might be focusing on pre-shot. And as I've already mentioned, as a researcher, it can help me see kind of cognitive differences between different types of performers. Hopefully that just gives you a little insight into what Think Aloud is. And also from a technological perspective, a lot of coaches that we work with might not necessarily use a clip mic and dictaphone. They might use their mobile phones, and sometimes they'll use the wireless headphones. And some of the endurance athletes that I work with might have a little mic clip to the front of their bike. So there's different kind of tech that you can play around with, and that's often a question that I get when I deliver these kinds of presentations. What I will say is that we will leave questions, hopefully around 15 minutes at the end. So if anyone has got any questions, please feel free to ask them at the end, I'll pop them in the chat as we go. So as Phil mentioned, we've kind of applied Think Aloud to quite a lot of different contexts over the years. And I've just mentioned there golf, tennis. We've looked at kind of stress and coping as a theoretical framework across cricket and tennis. We've looked at theories around skill acquisition in Australian rules football and looked from a expertise difference between like more experienced adults versus juniors. We've looked at like cycling's a big area of research that we've looked at, and we've also looked at things like whether Think Aloud has an impact on brain activity. So we've looked at brain imaging and looked at the prefrontal cortex and whether does Thinking Aloud actually change anything in the prefrontal cortex. The research that we have done is quite small sample, etc., and it's only a pilot study, but it's shown that it doesn't really have that much of an impact or a negative impact on performance, cognition, etc. So that's often a criticism of this method, is that it can be, detrimental to performance. And the work we've done so far has shown that it's actually not. So I guess when we look at why Think Aloud and why should it be a method that we can use, one from a research perspective but also from an applied perspective, and I always come back to Daniel Kahneman's work on the experiencing and remembering self. So apologies if anyone's watched any of my other presentations, because I always come back to this. But Daniel Kahneman talks about how we've got two types of selves. We've got this experiencing self and we've got this remembering self. And the remembering self is what we choose to keep from in our memory from an experience. But often this this remembering self can be influenced by key critical moments, or often what we feel at the end of an event. So actually we can be having a very nice experience, but the ending of the event might be less kind of pleasant, and our memory of that event might be unpleasant, when actually most of it was relatively pleasant. So here, let me just give you an example. And again, if you've seen Daniel Kahneman's TED Talk, you'll know the answer to this. But Daniel Kahneman talks about this idea that he's got patient A and patient B, and I think this was an actual experiment with two patients undergoing a colonoscopy, where both patients reported their pain levels on a scale of 1 to 10 every 60 seconds. Now, the question that's asked to the audience is which patient experiences the most pain? Is it patient A or patient B? And what tends to happen is the audience report patient B experiences more pain because the duration of the event is longer, it must be more unpleasant for a longer period of time. But actually, when participants are asked how much they think they suffered, it's always patient B that reports suffering more than patient A. And the reason being is because patient A has experienced a higher level of pain at the end of the event than patient B. Therefore, the memory is worse, or they view the experience as worse. So if you haven't seen it, this TED Talk is definitely worth a watch. But the point of me going off on a huge tangent about colonoscopy is that Think Aloud is capturing the experience. It's capturing all the thought processes from the experience. And often, from a research perspective, we might interview someone after the event. Now, if we interview someone after the event, we're potentially only capturing the memory. If we go back to coaching, and where we ask coaches to reflect, and they only reflect retrospectively, then we need to think about, well, what are they reflecting on? Are they reflecting on the experience, or are they reflecting on the memory? And also, what are they losing if they're only reflecting on the memory? Hence the use of Think Aloud in terms of being able to capture that experience as it occurs. Hope that makes sense. But what we'll do, we'll jump into some of the research, and I'll come back to kind of the application to coaching after we've covered a few of the areas of research that we've looked at. So the first piece of work that I ever did that Phil's mentioned is, again, the first question is, does Think Aloud, does it have a negative impact on performance? Is it a relative? Is it an appropriate tool for us to understand cognition in golf? So the first task of mine was to look at asking participants to think aloud affect performance, and we found that it didn't. Actually asking them to verbalise their thoughts out loud improved performance, especially in our novices. And we also looked at the difference in terms of what was verbalized during performance, and then what was compared to what was verbalized retrospectively. And going back to the experiencing versus remembering kind of concepts, we found that there was a very different type of information that was verbalized during an interview retrospectively. So when participants were telling us about the golf and about the decisions that they were making after the event, it was very much impacted by the outcome of the shot. So I'll give you an example. A golfer would hit a ball. It might not have been a great shot. They might not have seen where it's landed. They're verbalizing it was quite a negative shot. They're not happy with it. But actually, when they get to the ball, it's landed on the edge of the green, and it's quite a nice, easy chip onto the green. They finish in a par. They're relatively happy. So there's a positive memory from that shot. And then retrospectively, it's described as a more successful, more positive, and they forget that it was a less successful shot because of the outcome. Then we looked at the differences between skill level between experts and novices or higher skilled performers. And we found that higher skilled performers verbalise things like planning and gathering information, and were very externally focused in their verbalisations, where we found that novices were much more technical in their verbalisations. And then we also looked at kind of how cognition changes from practice to competition. And through the use of Think Aloud, we were able to see that those people that were more likely to choke under pressure became much more technically focused during competition, because the pressure and the stress of competition caused them to regress slightly in terms of an overfixation on technical elements of performance. One of the things that people always ask me is, how do we train people to think aloud? So we also published a study from more specifically in golf to look at the most suitable ways to train people. So I haven't got time to cover that in detail today, but if anyone's interested on the training process of Think Aloud, please see that paper there by Phil Birch and I. Finally, more recently, we've looked at, what are the cognitive processes that golfers go through when they play golf. And within this study with Trish Jackman, we've managed to come up with a framework of cognitive processing within golf to be able to show how golfers may go through this process of monitoring, planning, appraising the situation. And then after they've hit the shot, they will again monitor, evaluate, and appraise the situation. And then there's variables in that around being able to cope with distractions and using specific psychological skills. Finally, we've looked at how Think Aloud can be used as an applied tool within golf. So we've been able to show that actually Think Aloud can help golfers as a self-regulation tool. So being able to use it yourself as a golfer to practice thinking aloud and then listening back to this at a later date. Golfers are able to kind of self-regulate, self-learn, self-coach, and become more aware of some of their maybe more limiting thought processes, maybe more negative self-talk, and be more aware of the positive processes that they might go through. So hopefully you can see there the kind of journey between using Think Aloud from a research perspective to be able to apply Think Aloud to help a performer improve. And then within cycling, we've kind of done a range of different projects, but ultimately what we're interested in is, what does a cyclist think about during different time points during an event? And how can we use that information to, again, support a cyclist to think better, think more effectively. And also the big question we get from a lot of cyclists is, how do I cope with pain? I don't have the answer to that in terms of, if I did, I'd probably earn a lot of money from it. But what we found, again, just to summarize this work and in general, is that a cyclist will go through kind of different types of thoughts at different time points during a 16.1 kilometer time trial. And there's clear differences between like novices or untrained performers and trained performers. So as you can see here, the darker line is our trained performer and the lighter line is our untrained performer. And this is the pacing profile. So this is also the pace and how consistent that is. So you can see that it's very different between trained and untrained performers. But what we tended to find with more trained performers is that they're very focused on power output and they're very good at controlling their emotions, whereas our untrained or more novice participants use more distraction thoughts and talk much more about pain and discomfort, because that was something that they weren't used to. Again, it was much more complex than this in terms of the findings and the themes over time. But what we were able to do with this kind of data is also look at things like power output, heart rate. Even in one study, we looked at kind of blood lactate levels and looked at the relationship between what we were thinking and what was going on physiologically within our body, and was there a relationship between the two. or what kind of coping strategies were our elite performers or more trained performers thinking during them time periods in comparison to our novices. Now, I've got a little video to show you of a cyclist using Think Aloud. It is outdoors during a real life time trial, so you might not actually be able to hear too much of what he's saying, but hopefully it'll just give you an idea of some of the data that we can collect as well through some of the technology we use. He does at halfway get stopped by a vehicle, and then we've beeped out a lot of his swear words. So I think you'll get the idea of what he's saying.
Go on, work it on myself. Push, push, push. No. Work. Come on!
What you can actually see during the time that he's swearing is, I don't know if we've got any cyclists here, but his power is 800 watts, and that's extremely high. So he's obviously extremely frustrated and angry, and he's obviously trying to get his time back. But if I was a coach working with this performer, and we want his average watts to be 400, then that's a bit of an issue if he's going to kind of burn out too early. So again, we can look at what's happening cognitively and from a performance output perspective.
Okay, calm down. Go the window, way back, come on.
So he's just said to himself there, calm down, you've got the wind on your back, come on. So he's using like a coping mechanism, a self-regulation strategy to kind of get himself back in the zone.
Wait, this last kick. Keep spinning. Oh.
I really need to work on subtitles for that video, but hopefully you get the idea. So we've kind of touched a little bit there on how we might use Think Aloud from a research perspective to understand golfer cognition, cyclist cognitions. As I've mentioned earlier, we've also looked at like tennis players, and just from a bit of a logistics perspective, we asked them to think aloud between points. We ask people and bowlers to think aloud between batting and between bowling. Again, kickers, relatively straightforward, just think aloud in between kicks and kind of talking through the pre-kick routine. But when we look at coaches and kind of how we've applied this to coaching, we do kind of take a little bit of a different approach. So I guess when I came to the end of my PhD in around 2015, I'd spent 5 years following golfers around the golf course, asking them to think aloud. And a lot of the time a golfer would come off the course and say, okay, that's really been really helpful. I've thought through my process more clearly, I've become aware. Now that is a limitation from a research perspective, because Think Aloud shouldn't cause reactivity, shouldn't make us to think about thinking, but with some people it did. I work a lot in coaching. Coaches often talked about how reflection was seen as surveillance. It was seen as boring. It was always retrospectively after the event. So one of the things we kind of piloted in 2015-16 was, can we use Think Aloud to facilitate and promote the use of Think Aloud within coaches? So what we did in the top study there is we just introduced coaches to the kind of concept of Think Aloud. We give them a clip mic and dictaphone, and we ask them to try it out during a coaching session. Now, we just took them through this process where we introduced them to Think Aloud in a workshop setting. Like I've just mentioned, we showed them a video, asked them to verbalise their thoughts as they were watching a coaching video. And then within a 2-week period, we said, in your natural environment, as you're coaching, try thinking aloud where possible. But the main difference here is that we ask coaches to think aloud and then reflect on what they were verbalizing. Now, some of you might be thinking, how can someone verbalize when they're coaching and the athlete stood right next to them? And you're absolutely right. What we also ask coaches to do is step back out the way from their athletes. And this is obviously easier in some sports than others, where it's not as easy in some sports. So for example, I've used this within strength and conditioning coaches, where a coach might be stood directly behind an athlete. If he's doing a squat, for example, we then ask them to kind of move to the back of the room. But we always ask them also to tell the athletes that they're working with what they're doing. It's not a surveillance tool about the athletes, it's a reflection tool for them. So in that 2-week period between workshops, we ask coaches to listen back to their audio and then just come and share their kind of thoughts and their reflections on their Think Aloud. And what tends to happen is coaches will say things like, I've become so much more aware of how I communicate, maybe how I ask questions, how I've got biases over some players, kind of a favour of others. I'm able more now to react quicker if a session's not going well. And it just initially creates this element of self-awareness. Now, I'm not saying that becoming self-aware means you're going to become the best coach in the world, but if you've got a critical friend or within a kind of community of practice, you can hopefully become more aware and then look at how you can develop and change and improve. And that's kind of the aim of the Think Aloud program for coaches. I ask coaches then to think about kind of what they're reflecting on, what did they observe about themselves, ask them why did they reflect on this, what is it about them as coaches that's kind of making them be more aware or observe certain things within their practice, and then consider how this then impacted their coaching. As with reflection, it's really important that we change something, or we have actions as a result of it. So we then ask them to think about, what are they going to do, change, keep, etc. So I've just kind of stolen this from different reflective models and created a bit of a simple hybrid for coaches to reflect on their Think Aloud audio. And as I've just mentioned, so this was actually some of the outcomes from that first research project. But we found that coaches talked about this increased awareness. So they thought a lot more about their sessions, considered what their players are thinking, and they try and put themselves in their shoes. Communication for me is one of the biggest ones. So being conscious of what they're saying, are they talking too much? So I did a big project with the FA where at that time they were very much focused on allowing the players to play. So they were continuously reflecting on, is the ball on the pitch? Am I allowing players to play? Am I stepping in too much? And that was kind of a big focus within that program that I delivered. And what I will say is I think that what coaches reflect on during the use of Think Aloud can very much be dependent on kind of what that national governing body or what that team or what that sporting organisation are currently focused on. And we've been working with a tennis academy over the last couple of years who are really interested in developing good coach-athlete relationship and autonomy supportive coaching. So that's something that they use Think Aloud to reflect on. And I've got a video to show you, which kind of gives you a little bit of an insight into that soon. So yeah, again, I've mentioned questioning own biases, realizing that you're favoring some players over others. And then ultimately as coaches, we want to improve our practice, right? So some of these coaches were able to recognize when things weren't going quite to plan, and being able to change more kind of on the fly, as this coach says, and be able to reflect in the action and in the session rather than waiting until the session's over and when they were driving home. And then to develop this work further, Laura Swetnam and I worked with a Category 1 football academy just pre-COVID. And we looked at how we apply Think Aloud into a football coaching context also. And we looked at how we could use Think Aloud to develop these 3 types of knowledge. So we looked at the professional knowledge, the interpersonal knowledge, and the intrapersonal knowledge. So for example, how can a coach use Think Aloud to develop their professional knowledge of technical, tactical knowledge of the sport, etc. Interpersonal knowledge is all about how their ability to connect and to communicate with their athletes and stakeholders, and that intrapersonal knowledge, that knowledge of reflection and being able to to self-regulate and to be self-aware. And so what we did here, so we took the coaches through exactly the same process. We introduced them to Think Aloud, and they practiced the use of Think Aloud in their own context within the football academy. What did happen is that halfway through the program, we had to shut down because of COVID. But we went back to these coaches and we asked them, how has Think Aloud, benefited you? What do you think the benefits are or could be if you'd use this further? And this is what the coaches came back to us with. So they talked to us about Think Aloud being able to help them with player development. So it helped them to support their players within the academy, to be able to design and adapt coaching sessions more effectively. Again, similar to the previous study, helped us the coaches be able to communicate better, not just with their own athletes, but with their core coaches and their colleagues. It helped develop stronger relationships. And again, similarly, it helped them become aware of personal biases relating to certain players with different abilities, and develop their self-awareness and their reflection skills. So again, some really nice outcomes from the use of Think Aloud within the different context of football. Some quotes here from the coaches. So coaches talked about Think Aloud, help them reflect on the language that they're using, their tone. Are they overcritical? Are they too positive? Being able to be consciously aware of some of these things that are important to us. And then again, if we look at the bottom quote about reflecting on the good stuff as well, what good stuff's happening. He's put, that's great, this is working really well, he's responded to that, this session works well. So being able to recognize the good stuff in the coaching session. And I think as coaches, we often, when we reflect, we're always focusing on, the what we did wrong and what we can improve, but actually Think Aloud enabled this coach to also be aware of the good practice as well. And then finally, when we look at Think Aloud within the tennis context, we've been using Think Aloud within the tennis academy, as I've mentioned. And within the academy, we spent, during lockdown, because it was an elite tennis academy, they were still able to run. So I provided some online CPD where I met with the coaches at different time points. And they use Think Aloud to, one, reflect on their academy values, which we focus on a different value each month. But again, like I mentioned earlier, one of the big things that they were really conscious about, or felt were really important to them, was kind of bringing awareness to this, or being autonomy supportive as a coach. And we use the Empower kind of observation system quite loosely, but we talk with the coaches through what autonomy support is and how they might be autonomy supportive in their practice. So I've got a short video just to show you of a coach using Think Aloud. And what you will notice, however, is that he doesn't think aloud continuously. He kind of watches the player play, he has a discussion with the player, so he's trying to adopt a certain type of questioning to allow her to input, and then he will think aloud and kind of reflect on what the kind of interaction he's just had with the player. So there are different kind of ways that coaches have been adopting it over the years. You won't hear much until kind of the second half of the video.
Reel of the boys.
One sec. How are you feeling right now, Abby? What are your feelings?
Not too good.
Okay. That's perfectly understandable. Can you give me a bit more information? What you're feeling?
Annoyed that I'm missing my first ball.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think's the best way forward?
Don't miss the first ball. Taking time.
Okay. And do you think it's normal to feel how you're feeling?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough drill. Yeah, it's a real tough drill. You're receiving a tough feed, and the opponents are right on it. Any response that you give, and you're out of position. Yeah. So I think the key is to try to accept that, keep giving your best, commit to each individual shot at a time, stay positive, all right, and reset yourself really well. Okay. Okay. Thinking aloud after intervening with Abby. Obviously, taking part in a really tough drill, if the first ball is not effective, then she automatically loses the point. She's in a defensive situation. Obviously really struggling, but my sense was that letting her talk about how she was feeling and verbalising that did help in that moment. So we'll see how she does right now, but she seems to have a better look of focus and more positive look about her right now.
So what you'll hopefully have got there is that the coach has worked on type of questioning that allows the player to contribute more to the decision making, and then the coach is reflecting on that and whether he thought that was effective or not. And then finally, I just want to play a recording from another coach that I've worked with in football, and I asked Fiona to give me a summary of her use of Think Aloud, how she's used it in her practice, and the impact or any benefit she found from using it.
Think Aloud has become an effective new addition to my coaching sessions and my match day routines. Through regular use, I have become more skilled in using Think Aloud. Initially, I had found myself commentating too much. I also found large gaps of silence in my recordings as I was forgetting to think aloud. But like any new skill, the more you practice it, the better you become. And Think Aloud has now become a very valuable tool to me as a coach. I actually refer to it now as my new virtual assistant coach and my virtual coach developer. It's very easily set up. All I needed was my mobile phone, a headset with the recording device, and I downloaded a voice recorder app. One thing I will advise people is let other people know that's going to be involved in the sessions that you are using the Think Aloud process, so that they don't think you're crazy talking to yourself on the sideline. But by verbalising your thoughts during your sessions and your games, by stepping back and observing why you're doing things, are you happy with what you're saying? You're able then to make those adjustments and changes instantly. You're reflecting on your sessions and your matches in real time, as opposed to the common practice of reflecting on your training sessions after they have finished or after your matches have finished, which will be more beneficial to your players. It will improve you as a coach quicker, and it will also improve the sessions for those players. As a coach, you do become more self-aware. You're constantly asking yourself, why am I doing this? Am I happy with what I'm doing? Do I need to change anything? So you're improving yourself constantly as a coach. Also, by listening back, you can hear how you're communicating to everyone. Is there a difference in your communication style on match days where it might be deemed as a more pressurised environment? Or is your communication style just the same as what it is in training? So it's very valuable to that, to listen back to yourself in context of a football match and in training sessions. I also find it useful to hear the questions that the players were asking during your sessions or during your matches. It gives you a greater insight into who's asking the questions, and maybe that they're not understanding your communication style, and then you can adjust that accordingly, which then will improve that session for that player. It can be used in so many different ways, but you definitely do improve in many different areas as a coach. For me, I did find it more time efficient. Because I was able to reflect during the sessions, during matches, you were able to make the changes there and then. By recording what's happening, when you go back to reflect on your matches and your training sessions, you don't have to worry about forgetting anything because it's all been recorded. You can listen to it at a later time. We all don't have the luxury of being able to sit down straight away after our sessions and analyse what has just happened. It's just not practical sometimes. So with this being recorded, you can then look back at a later date. You can listen to it in your car on the way home. You can listen to it while you're doing other mundane tasks, maybe around the house. So I do find Think Aloud process is very effective. It's very time efficient. And I do find it a simple but very effective tool for coaches. And I would highly recommend any coach to try it.
So hopefully you've managed to get a little bit of a flavour of what Think Aloud is, how it's been used within practice. There are some limitations to using Think Aloud, such as the initial kind of, I guess, teething problems, like getting used to being able to process or attend to the process of thinking aloud and to the activity itself. And I have found definitely that a lot of coaches or athletes definitely need kind of a familiarization process. So that is something to be aware of. Other things to be aware of are things like allowing the parents to know that you're using Think Aloud if you are coaching, or the people that you're working with, make them aware, so they don't think that you're kind of making audio notes of them and you kind of using it as a surveillance tool. So from just to conclude, I haven't mentioned kind of the use of Think Aloud from an applied sports psychology perspective. So if we've got any sports psychologists on the session tonight, it can be used from a practitioner perspective to understand the client. I use that a lot myself. It can be used and framed within many different philosophies of practice. It helps us to assess the internal processes, both as a practitioner or a coach, and for us to understand our athletes. And it can be used to complement other approaches and be used at different phases if you are a sports psychologist. And also, like as I've mentioned, there's many kind of different ways in which Think Aloud can be used, which I guess was the point of this talk. Originally, it was developed as a research data collection tool, so the Think Aloud protocol, again by Erickson and Simon, as I've mentioned earlier. But over the years, we've adapted it and developed it slightly in different ways to be used as a coach reflection tool. If we've got any coach developers in the room, I've used it as a coach development tool. So I've worked with coach developers who've used it as a reflection tool for themselves to reflect on how they're supporting their coach. But then they've also asked their coach to use it so they can share that audio as a way to kind of open up further dialogue about how they can help that coach develop. Now, there is a caveat to that in that the coach might feel it's a surveillance tool, but I think if you've got a good enough relationship with the coach that you're working with, then they should feel comfortable to share that. And then, as I've just mentioned, as a sports psychologist, you might use it to understand your athlete, or you might use it yourself, kind of more of as a kind of an immediate retrospective method between consultations. So hopefully that's given you a whistle-stop tour of Think Aloud and how it can be applied to different contexts. As I've mentioned earlier, if you do want any more information or you would like me to share any of the papers, please do drop me an email or find me on Twitter at @A_Whitehead1, and I'm more than happy to share some of the other work that we've done if you want to have a read in more detail. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing now, Phil, and open up to questions.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much, Amy. I've got a host of questions written down here and some really nice examples that you shared there in terms of just the range of different ways in which this particular tool can be applied. If anybody has questions, by all means, just drop them into the chat, or if you prefer, you can you can raise your hand and I can invite you to ask your question yourself as well. There's a reactions button. It should be available to you on your screen where you can just raise your hand. I'm going to start with Ali, who had the first question to the chat, and one actually that I had written down myself as well. In terms of when you're introducing this to coaches, so, you know, is there an optimal frequency that you found for coach development in terms of how often they should be recording Think Aloud, listening back to it? Is there a certain series of sessions you recommend first, or what's the recommendation?
Yeah, no, I'd need to come up with more of a how-to guide. From experience, I've between kind of check-in sessions with the coaches, I always ask them to use it at least twice. One, because the first time they use it, it's very uncomfortable, and sometimes, like, I always tell a story, but sometimes they kind of talk too much and they start telling me the color, like saying the color of the grass and the sky, and they start to describe everything that's going on, and that's because it is an uncomfortable process, or they might not verbalize at all. Some people say it's really difficult to kind of get their thought processes out. But what I usually find is after that first kind of initial trial of that was awful, the next time they use it, they find it's completely different. So I always kind of would recommend a couple times, and then to check in with the coach if there is that kind of co-coaching or coach development going on. One thing I will say is not to use it consecutively, kind of 4 or 5 sessions in a row, because we have found, and we published a paper on this, where a coach became quite obsessive with his own thought processes, and it kind of became a distraction. So he kind of was reflecting and thinking more about what he was thinking and not as much about what was going on the pitch and with his players. So there is a kind of a risk of becoming like too internal with our thoughts. So that's why I always say, like, kind of 1 or 2 times, have a rest for a few weeks, kind of, and then come back to it.
Yeah, it's really nice. And actually that answers, I think, Peter Lavin's question, which is going into the chat there as well, in terms of, you know, how often you recommend to use that. And I do think, you know, from my experience, you could generate an awful lot from one transcript. And I don't know if you found the same as well. Actually, you don't need to generate a huge amount of this every session, because, you know, you do a couple of sessions, you'll actually get a lot to think about, to work about, to try out there. Is that what you found as well?
Yeah, completely. And I think even though they might not physically be using Think Aloud in their next couple of coaching sessions, they're still conscious of some of them thoughts that they were verbalizing last time. So we have found like a real lasting impact of Think Aloud. The project we did with coach developers, we went back to them like 20 months later, and a lot of them said, although we've not got the clip mic and the dictaphone on, we're still thinking, what am I thinking and why am I thinking that? And some of these coach developers had other jobs, not outside of sport, and they'd kind of started to apply it to them contexts as well. Like when I'm doing holding a board meeting, I'm thinking, well, why am I gonna say this, and how is that person receiving that? So that was one of like some of the really nice kind of outcomes that we got from it.
Yeah, again, I think, as you said there, you know, there's lots of areas of human performance where this could be applied. I know we've had some inquiries and pieces from physiotherapists as well. So anyone dealing with clients, anytime where you're observing and thinking, you can see the potential application of this. Ty Glam, who's joining us from tennis, has asked if there's a template for a coach to introduce Think Aloud into his or her practice. Is there some kind of a template that you recommend or use?
So I did design some resources for UK coaching. I'm sure they wouldn't mind if I shared it. We created a bit of an infographic, which was just kind of step-by-step guides on how to kind of introduce Think Aloud to you and your colleagues. So I'll pop that on to Twitter with UK Coaching's permission. But that within that template, what we always recommend is that a coach can try this at home. Like every one of us now, after this call, can go make a cup of tea, coffee, whatever your drink of choice is, and practice verbalizing your thoughts out loud. Or we also advocate, like when you're watching, you might be watching the World Cup at the minute, and practice verbalizing what you're thinking as you're watching it, and kind of doing it in a more safe context and setting. And that's kind of what we advise as an introductory kind of practice, and then go and try it out maybe just for 10 minutes within your coaching context. But again, going back to some of the original questions, you don't always have to do it for the whole hour or hour and a half of training. You might just kind of do it for a couple of minutes in the warm-up, a couple of minutes in the main session. It can be adaptable and completely up to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the other aspect is actually lots of us do think aloud anyway in different contexts. I know my wife was laughing at me when I was talking about this, and when you're driving, when something happens when you're driving, then you verbalize without any filter, you're thinking aloud straight away. So I think it is something that a lot of people recognize we do, but actually it's just adapting it into the context, which is just takes a little bit of practice, but it can certainly help then.
Yeah.
We have another question come in from Ali again. Did you notice any contrast between audio and video? So did the verbal match the visual coaching behaviors?
So we haven't formally kind of done that level of analysis, but what I use, so the video that I showed you today wasn't actually part of the research. It was more we did that for the coaches' benefit. They then shared some of their videos with other coaches. But what I will say is about video is that I often advocate against video and just promote the dictaphone and clip mic, because once we put a video in front of a coach, the coach then becomes fixated on what the players are doing and how the players are behaving. And although that's really important, what we want to know is what you're thinking. And what processes and reflections are you going through? So that's kind of why I'm much more interested in the audio element. I know, sorry, it doesn't really answer Ali's question.
No, I think it's very interesting, certainly, and I think where video can scare off coaches sometimes, and it can be a bit more intimidating. I think this is something that you relatively quickly forget about.
Yeah, that's a great point, Phil. And also it's cheaper, it's easier, it's probably quicker to set up, like just using a clip mic and dictaphone. And yeah, as soon as you put a camera in the corner, everyone else starts acting a little bit funny as well.
Absolutely. I've got one question in terms of just kind of thinking about what you were presenting through, and you commented about, I think within the academy context, the coaches found that it helped them in their communication with other coaches. I'm just curious as to whether you applied this with an explicit focus on partnerships in coaching, or a coach assistant coach. So to try and help coaches and assistant coaches, I guess, better align what they're seeing, or coaches and mentor coaches. So have you looked at it in terms of any partnerships like that?
We haven't looked at that kind of explicitly, but what I have found within the football academy, and also when I was working with the rugby league club, is that they were work coaching in pairs. So kind of by accident, I found that they became like a critical friend to one another. And I didn't initiate this, but they then started sharing their audio with one another. And that's kind of where that finding came from, is that they felt that they were developing better relationships with their core coaches. And then when we were bringing them into kind of a workshop to share their like reflections on Think Aloud, I didn't really have to do much at all, because they would kind of initiate. It was very much kind of client-centered, if you will. Like they all just were quite happy to kind of share what they'd learned from the process, and then they all started supporting one another. I think I often talk about this element of vulnerability when we use Think Aloud and when I'm working with coaches. And there is a different level of openness depending on who I'm working with and how safe they feel within the environment. But most of the coaches that I've worked with have all kind of been quite close and felt quite safe, and then been able to share the Think Aloud quite easily. But I think in an environment where that might not be the case, or psychological safety might not be there, I think we do run the risk of it being deemed as surveillance and maybe not wanting to share them thought processes.
Yeah, I think certainly these days that concern and that care around surveillance and the perception of surveillance is a really important one, and certainly a very useful one for you to emphasize several times. Just thinking in terms of I guess getting on the same page. So we just talked about two coaches being on the same page in terms of perceptions. We've a really nice question again from Tig in terms of thinking about the coach's perception of what a player is thinking and the player's perception of a situation, and think aloud being used almost to check the alignment between the coach's perception of what the athlete's thinking and what the player or the athlete is thinking. Again, have you explored that particular use of it with coaches?
Yeah, it's a great question, thank you. And we haven't formally done this within any of the research, but I've got a master student starting a project on this currently, because it's such a great idea to look at kind of that coach-athlete relationship element. Outside of sport, there's a lot of discussions around patient and kind of doctor relationship and compliance, and kind of and it's a similar thing, like, is what the coach telling me, do they think, what am I trying to say? So am I understanding what the coach is trying to communicate, if that makes sense, and kind of getting the athletes' perspectives of how they view a session and how they're experiencing a session versus the coach. And I think it'd be so powerful to see whether that aligns, because I can imagine some coaches thinking they're doing a brilliant job and the players are like, this is like what's going on today, and there might just be a disconnect between the communication. But yeah, we're working on that at the minute, so hopefully in the next year or two I'll be able to share them findings.
Excellent. Always good to have a watch this space plug coming through. We have another question from William Geary come through, and particularly interesting one, I think, in terms of gender differences with Think Aloud, particularly with maybe female coaches think aloud when they're dealing with a male-dominated group, or male coaches when dealing with a female-dominated group. And have you had any, I guess, experience or any coaches who have applied Think Aloud in that instance, and has that been helpful in terms of what you've uncovered?
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't found gender differences, but I have found individual differences. So I find that we get kind of some people, like you said, Phil, like who naturally will think aloud anyway, and it'll be so easy for them and so natural, and they kind of say, well, I kind of do this anyway, so but I'll just put a dictaphone, a clip mic on, and it'll be recorded. And then I do find, so a lot of people have asked me about kind of, I don't really like this term, but personality types, or certain types of individuals that are less kind of outspoken or confident to verbalise. So I do see kind of personal individual differences, and that's something that I really want to explore in terms of, is there a certain type of person that Think Aloud is more easier, I guess, for? I think it can be used with everybody, but I have found within some of the data that some people will verbalise as well, much more than others. And then I also ask the question, do people not have as much to say, or they keep holding it back a little bit, because they're kind of filtering. We have a lot of overthinkers that kind of have to overthink that information before they verbalise it, and there's a difference there. So yeah, I haven't really found major gender differences. Laura Swettenham did look at gender differences in tennis and found kind of how men and women might use different coping strategies to certain stressors, but I'm always a little bit dubious about kind of talking about gender differences, because I don't like to pigeonhole men and women as being kind of vastly different.
Yeah, I think you and me both there, my students will always know very well that if they raise the possibility of males and females reacting differently, they better have a very good reason as to why they're hypothesizing that, or it shouldn't be appearing in the first place. And I think that's a really nice one you raised there again around the potential for overthinking. So again, anybody thinking about bringing this in with coaches that they're working with, or players potentially that they're working with, that actually, you know, one thing to be considerate about is, you know, are you dealing with somebody who has a tendency to overthink? You know, and this is something to be maybe used a bit more cautiously or carefully in that instance. We're just got a minute over time, and I'm really conscious of taking up your time when you're doing a lot of webinars at the moment, Amy. So I'm actually going to call a halt to it there. We've gone through the questions as well. Thank you very much to everyone in the audience for the questions and your attention over the past hour. Thank you very much, Amy, in terms of your contribution this evening. It's been a really fascinating insight into this tool, and I think there's loads of ideas that people can take away from this as to how they can apply this to many different domains. Really appreciate you for sharing your contact details as well, and we'll make sure we pop them up on the Twitter as well afterwards so people can see this. In terms of the Sport and Human Performance Research Centre, I think this is our final talk for 2022, but do keep an eye on the Twitter feed for some more talks which will be announced starting in the early new year. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a very good evening.
Thanks, Phil.